So this is my favorite story of the day. This is Fox and Friends had this impromptu debate on Russia's war in Ukraine. And it's actually good. Like, I was surprised. You know, I'm used to, when I'm watching these Fox clips, I'm used to being in mock mode. Like, I just wait for them to say the dumbest things possible, and then my commentary is like, hey, look, they said the dumbest thing possible. But that's not what happened here. What happened here is it was actually a decent back and forth where you get a pretty good representation of both positions. One position being sort of the Russian state line about, hey, well, we had to do this because it was kind of defensive in a sense. That's one position that one of the hosts is taking here. And then the other position is the Western position of like, don't give me that bullshit. This was aggressive, and you know it. Okay, so, and Ducey's kind of sitting on the sidelines. You'll see the ones who end up going at it here. But let's take a look, and then I'll react afterwards.
If you look at that map and the areas that they have that you say could end up in this peace agreement, that's true. And that's why we should have never provoked them. I mean, they made very clear that there was a red line. The red line was a neutrality for Ukraine, that they could not enter NATO. And in the end, when they get this, if they get this peace agreement, in the end, that's probably going to end up being the case anyway.
No,
I bet you that one of the conditions will have to be that Ukraine, you know, promise to remain neutral, will not be part of NATO.
Well, I'll tell you what, you can never give in to what Russia wants other nations to do. You decide, they're going to decide you go into NATO, you go into the European Union, when they're a European society that wants that.
Well, we have a Monroe Doctrine, and I think we would be very concerned about this kind of action in our hemisphere. I think he said, keep it neutral, and in the end, probably Ukraine is going to lose more land because of this. Again, the main problem here, as you see, and as we discussed, well, no, actually, the main problem is still China. And now we've created a bigger bloc, China and Russia together. This is why our policymakers aren't thinking long term. Right. Provoking this war has brought our two enemies closer together.
They provoked the war.
Well, they had a red line. And we had an agreement in November with a security agreement. They can't make a red line in other
countries, Rachel. It's not up to them to make a red line in other countries.
This is the fate of the geography of Ukraine. And they could have remained a free country. We could have armed them. We could have actually...
No, you understand. Russia got their way. They lost their stooge in an election. The minute they lost their stooge in an election, it had nothing to do with us. They took Crimea and the two Donbass regions. And they said, we're going to do more unless you put our guy back. We go, not only are we not going to put your guy back, we're going to have more elections. And then Zelensky beats Poroshenko, and now he established himself with 70% of the vote. Why should a democracy give up because Vladimir Putin's a lunatic?
Well, what is happening on the ground...
It's the reality. He is who he is. It's called realism.
Yeah, but realism is... Zelensky's a real person, too. And so are the people of Ukraine, are real people that have a right to their own destiny.
You can feel very bad for what is happening to the people of Ukraine, and you can also say that this was a preventable war in the end. And that, by the way, in the 2 weeks leading up to the war, when we kept saying, they're going to come in, they're going to... Why are the peace talks happening now after this country has been decimated and millions of people
there were tons of talks. They weren't sincere in any of their talks. There were talks with Macron. There were talks with Zelensky. There was talks with... How many talks did Biden have with?
My point is, I think our diplomats have been... their diplomacy has been anemic in this entire situation.
Well,
it's Vladimir Putin's fault, period.
Jeez. Look, that was interesting. That was an interesting back and forth. If you don't think so, watch it again, because it is. Okay, so let's go from the top here. She says, and I don't remember her name. What's her name? Is it Campos Duffy or something? Let me look that up real quick. I'm probably not going to get this. Rachel Campos Duffy. Oh, I got it right. Wow. I'm genuinely shocked that I got that right. Anyway, so Rachel says, she starts by saying, we never should have provoked them. And what she's referring to is NATO's expansion to Russia's border, provocative action, almost prods them into some sort of military response at some point, right? That's the point that she's making. But if you look at Kilmeade's face as she's talking about that, he's like, he doesn't buy it at all. He's like, this is bullshit. This is the rationalization for the aggression. Then we get, Russia can't tell a sovereign nation what to do. This is what Kilmeade said. Look, Russia, doesn't matter what they think about what Ukraine should or shouldn't do. They're their own sovereign nation. So the point he's making, which is true, is that this idea of a sphere of influence is bullshit. It's this imperial notion, right? Now, it's also part of a realist foreign policy view of like, that's just the way the world works. The bigger, more powerful countries kind of have control of the countries that are nearby them in a sense, right? So the realist view is spheres of influence are real as a heart attack. But his view, he's, at least in theory here, he's espousing the more principled, small d democratic position of like, no, that's bullshit. We shouldn't accept that framing. Russia can't tell a sovereign nation what to do. Now, of course, the interesting point to make about Kilmeade here is he would never accept that logic for the United States. Like, he accepts, when it comes to Russia, he accepts the notion spheres of influence are bullshit and you shouldn't and can't tell sovereign nations what to do. But if we were talking about the U.S. and our hemisphere, he would never apply that same standard to us and say like, well, we shouldn't have direct influence and say and control over what's going on in South America or what's going on. Cuba is a great example. They're directly in our sphere of influence. We've been trying to meddle with them, ever since the Castros took over when there was the revolution. And he's never said, oh, on principle, we can't do this because that's not fair. No, he buys into like, oh, they're a dictator, they're terrible, we should probably do things to undermine them and or overthrow them. So he's not consistent in his logic there, but at least in terms of, if he was, he'd have a point. If he says, hey, spheres of influence are bullshit, including our own, well, then it's like, okay, you got a point there. And then you have, Rachel says, we have a Monroe Doctrine, and we wouldn't accept this here. So her point is, if there was a Russian military alliance right on our border in Mexico or Canada, we wouldn't accept it. And that's a fact. And on that point, she's right. Like, we wouldn't accept that. Now, again, but then the question gets deeper because it's like, should we accept it? Like, if we take the logic of spheres of influence being bullshit, then if Canada and Mexico freely decided to do a military alliance with Russia, then you'd have to say, all right, it is what it is. There's nothing we could do about it. Now, as long as those countries don't attack us, then it is what it is. And we are in no position to like forcibly make them not have that military alliance. You understand what I'm saying? See, this is why this is interesting. There's layers of nuance and interesting, different positions and theories involved in this conversation. And then you get, she says the U.S. is provoking this war for a second time. And he snaps and says, we didn't provoke the war. They provoked the war. Saying, don't blame us. Don't blame the West. It is absolutely 100% Vladimir Putin who decided to do this. It was a decision, and he made it. And then they get into shockingly, they get into the history of what went down in Ukraine. And Kilmeade frames it as Russia lost their stooge in an election. And then they basically flipped out and were, funding separatists in the eastern portion of the country and basically trying to stage at some point an eventual takeover of some degree, whether it's another pro-Russian puppet government or they literally take the eastern portion of the country or whatever. But his point was Russia lost their stooge in an election, talking about Yanukovych. And she didn't respond to that. But actually, it's important to get into this claim a little bit too, because the people who are more on the pro-Russian side say it was a coup, that Yanukovych wasn't fairly deposed, that they tried to impeach him, but they were a few votes short on the impeachment, and so it doesn't count as a legitimate impeachment, and so it really was a coup, like a pro-Western coup. That's the point that the pro-Russian side makes, but the Western side makes the point that, okay, so we didn't have the votes to impeach Yanukovych, but what happened is Yanukovych called for elections and then fled the next day to Russia. So before they even had the elections, Yanukovych was gone. So they look at it as like, wasn't no damn coup. He left of his own volition, free of his own volition. And so we look at that as it's a revolution. And then they ended up having an actual election. So like Zelensky won, I believe it was in 2019, in a democratic election. So this idea when people try to connect the coup and or revolution, however you view it, to what happened in 2019, there is no connection. It's not like Zelensky overthrew Yanukovych or whatever. Zelensky was installed. That didn't happen. But look, the thing is, you could see the grain of truth in both sides there. On the Russian side, they're like, well, you didn't hit the impeachment barrier, so Yanukovych was still the rightful president. That's the point that they make. But on the Western side, they say, well, it doesn't matter. We didn't hit the impeachment barrier. He called for an election, then he fled. So he's not going to govern the country from Russia. He ran to Russia. So what do you want us to do? We move forward, and eventually we had elections. So point is, you can see the take from both sides on that when you look at the history of it. And then Kilmeade talks about how Russia was never serious about any of these talks, because Rachel's like, we gotta use negotiation and diplomacy, and we gotta find a solution. We gotta find a way out of this, which is true. That's absolutely true. But Kilmeade is like, Putin he's not actually interested in finding a solution. He's interested in doing what he wants to do. And he says it's 100% on Vladimir Putin. So what's my overall takeaway from this conversation? In all seriousness, I think they both make decent arguments at different times. I do. I don't think Kilmeade would apply the same logic he uses, the same standard he holds Russia to, that he would hold the U.S. to that standard. He wouldn't at all. But you could see what Rachel's instinct is I want to try to find a way to blame Biden. That's her instinct, and the West. And Kilmeade's instinct is our official baddie nation, very, very bad. We don't like the baddie nation. They're authoritarian, and they threaten global order and stability. So bad, 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 bad. And again, I think there's a number of things they say on both sides here make sense. And I will end on this point, though, because I do feel like this is really, really important. In the end, I think Rachel's main argument fails in a very key respect, which is she starts talking about NATO and how, hey, we provoked this, et cetera, et cetera. I would have agreed with that, not too long ago. I would have said maybe that's the primary motivating factor here. But the fact of the matter is, on February 21st, before the invasion, Zelensky came out and said, it's a dream for Ukraine to get to NATO. I don't think it's going to happen. And then I just covered the story today. You had Zelensky come out again and say, in no uncertain terms, Ukraine's not going to be in NATO. It's not going to be in NATO. It's just not. We're just not going to get into NATO. It's just that simple. So if that was the main concern of Vladimir Putin, and that is really why he's doing this, well, you already won on the thing that you say is your biggest issue. You already won. It is a full concession. So are you going to withdraw? You're going to withdraw, right? Oh, you didn't withdraw. Huh. Interesting. So maybe it wasn't all about NATO. Maybe NATO wasn't even the majority factor. Maybe there's ulterior motives. And so that's where Rachel's argument ultimately comes up short. I never would have expanded NATO in the first place because I don't want to give them any sort of potentially understandable argument for doing what they're doing. I never would have expanded NATO to their border, so they wouldn't have a claim of like Western aggression and we're just defending ourselves from it. But the fact of the matter is, there are other reasons here. I mean, Putin was very clear in that speech, other than the NATO thing. He did the blood and soil portion of the speech of Ukraine's a fake state. It used to be ours. It should be ours. They owe a debt to us. They turned their back on us. They went to the West. Now we're going to make the situation right, which is you should really be part of us. So he made that argument. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is there was a tremendous amount of natural gas found off the coast of Crimea, and then Putin took Crimea, and now in eastern Ukraine and western Ukraine, and Putin's trying to take Ukraine. I wonder if the oil and natural gas has something to do with it. No, it can't. It definitely can't, right? Can't have anything to do with that. In the U.S., everybody understands, hey, Iraq, maybe a lot of that had to do with oil. But with Russia, it can't be that, even though they're a petrostate. Don't be naive, dog. Don't be naive. And, of course, one of the other cover stories is denazification. Yeah. Don't get it twisted. Ukraine does have a neo-Nazi problem. I mean, the Azov battalion is part of the National Guard, and they admit that about 20% of their people are card-carrying neo-Nazis. Now, I think the number is actually higher in the Azov battalion of neo-Nazis, and there are some national heroes in Ukraine that are Nazis. I mean, it just is what it is, right? But the idea that this is the reason why Putin is doing it, definitely not true, because Russia also has a neo-Nazi problem. There are neo-Nazi groups and neo-Nazi fighters and neo-Nazi brigades and shit in Russia. So is Putin going to invade himself? Did he even purge the own extremists from his own ranks? No. So it's got nothing to do with denazification. That's just, one of the cover stories. But anyway, I think you get the gist of it here. Interesting debate. I think they both make good points at different times. And I'll leave it up to you guys to determine what you think makes sense and doesn't. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal Kyle and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.